Today, I'm going to be talking about the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson. This case is often remembered for creating the separate but equal doctrine. It's important to understand that it runs deeper than just a place for African Americans to sit on a train. Plessy versus Ferguson helps us understand what America looked like right after the Civil War and why racial segregation became legal, and also how one Supreme Court case decision shaped the lives of millions of African Americans for decades. But to understand this case a little bit better, you first have to conceptualize what was happening in the United States at the time. In 1865, the Civil War had just ended and slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment. Right after that, the 14th Amendment granted citizenship to anyone born in the United States, and that promised equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment also gave some black men the right to vote. During the Reconstruction era, the federal government worked to rebuild the South and protect the rights of the formerly enslaved people. For a short time, there was real progress. Black Americans they started opening businesses, attending schools. They were involved in politics more, and some of them even were elected into public offices. But of course, this progress was met with a lot of pushback in the South. Many of the white Southerners wanted to restore that racial hierarchy of the white dominance that had existed before the Civil War. In 1877, Reconstruction ended, and federal troops were withdrawn from the South. Now, with the federal troops gone, there's no more federal reinforcements. So southern states quickly passed laws designed to separate black and white citizens and to limit the rights of black Americans. And these laws became known as Jim Crow laws. They required segregation in schools, restaurants, houses, theaters, parks, hospitals, public transportation systems, anywhere you could think of, even cemeteries. Even though slavery had ended, racial inequality remained deeply rooted in society in that part of America. So what led to Plessy v. Ferguson is that in Louisiana in 1892, Louisiana passed the Separate Car Act, and that required railroad companies to provide separate train cars for white and black passengers. Now, a group called the Citizens Committee, they wanted to change that law because they believe it violated the 14th Amendment. The Citizens Committee, they selected Homer Plessy to test the law. Now, Homer Plessy was a very interesting person to choose because he was 7/8 white and just 1/8 black. He could very well pass as white, but under Louisiana law, if anyone had just a drop of black blood in them, they were considered black. And it's impossible to scientifically categorize someone as having just a drop of black, but that's the way the world turned back then. So on June 7th, 1892, Plessy purchased a first-class ticket and deliberately sat in the railroad car reserved for white passengers. He refused to move from the car, and he later went on to be arrested. So this was all planned out. It was not an accident. Everything was planned, and the Citizens Committee wanted Plessy to get arrested. They planned for it. They planned for it just so they could challenge the Louisiana segregation law in the court of law. The case went on to reach the Supreme Court, where the main constitutional question before became... Let me rewind for a second. I stumbled over myself. The main constitutional question before the court was simple when it reached the Supreme Court. Did laws requiring racial segregation violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment? The Supreme Court answered that question with a whopping 7-1 decision. The majority ruled that segregation was constitutional, as long as the facilities provided for each race were equal. According to the court, simply separating people by race did not violate the Constitution. In our book, in section 28.5, they categorize it as Plessy versus Ferguson gave legal sanction to segregated school systems. Now, the justices argued that if black Americans viewed segregation as a sign of being less, then that feeling came from society rather than being the law itself. The reasoning became known as the separate but equal doctrine. Although the phrase sounds simple and kind of reasonable at first, it was pushed far beyond the limits. We all grew up in America. We all heard about the stories of just how bad racial inequality was. Facilities for Black Americans were almost never equal. Schools received far less. Black schools received far less funding, and public transportation was often older and poorly maintained. Hospitals, parks, public services, they were all greatly inferior. The doctrine, separate but equal, became a legal justification for discrimination rather than genuine equality. There was only one justice who disagreed with the other justices, and it was Justice John Marshall Harlan. He argued that the Constitution should not separate citizens based on race, and he wrote that the Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. Although Harlan stood alone in 1896, history would eventually view his dissent as one of the greatest opinions ever written by a Supreme Court justice. So the most important question of this presentation is, what does Plessy versus Ferguson tell us about America during this period? First, it tells us that ending slavery didn't automatically create equality. The Civil War had ended more than 30 years earlier, but the majority of Americans still believe that Black and white citizens should live separately. While the Constitution promised equal protections, many states found ways to avoid treating citizens equally. Second, the case shows just how much power the Supreme Court had over everyday life. Many people think that the Supreme Court had as like a court that protects our rights. However, Plessy versus Ferguson's remind us that the court's decisions often reflects the beliefs and values of the era in which they are made of. By co-signing this behavior, the court gave legal approval to Jim Crow's laws throughout the South. States now had constitutional support to continue segregating nearly every aspect of public life. Third, this decision revealed that the federal government had stepped away from protecting the rights of Black Americans. Instead of following through with the promises made in the 14th Amendment, the Supreme Court showed a reflection of the true colors of America at the time. The effects of this decision were enormous, and schools remained segregated, neighborhoods became divided by race, public transportation, restaurants, hotels, hospitals, all operated under segregation, even down to hospitals. It's sad to read back and see those things. Millions of Americans experienced unequal treatment because of the nation's highest court had declared it constitutional. For 60 years, just around 60 years, Plessy versus Ferguson remained the law of the land. It wasn't until 1954, when Brown versus Board of Education, that the Supreme Court finally withdrew from the separate but equal doctrine. The court unanimously ruled that the separate educational facilities were inherently unequal. That decision became one of the defining moments of the civil rights movement and marked the beginning of the end of legally enforced segregation in the United States. Looking back today, many historians consider Plessy versus Ferguson as one of the worst Supreme Court decisions in American history. It shows us that constitutional rights are only as strong as the courts can interpret them. It also reminds us that the progress of American history let me rewind for a second. It reminds us that progress in American history has never been automatic. The country abolished slavery after the Civil War, but the struggle for true equality continued for many decades afterwards. And to this day, as of 2026, there are still racial inequalities. Plessy versus Ferguson reflected the end of the Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow laws, and the comfort of the federal government to accept racial segregation. The case reveals that America at the end of the 19th century was still deeply divided over race and equality. This decision helps students like me understand just how not, let me rewind for a second. I'm so sorry. This case reveals that America at the end of the 19th century was still deeply divided over race and equality. This decision helps us understand not only how segregation became legal, but also why later generations fought so hard during the civil rights movement to overturn it. That is what makes Plessy versus Ferguson so important and so consequential. It paved the way for the civil rights movement. If we didn't have separate but equal, we wouldn't have had, let's say, Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X. It's the butterfly effect is a crazy thing to think about.